Please, can I invite Fred Simmons to come join us? Our speaker today, my colleague at the Divinity faculty here, Frederick Simmons, is a research associate at the Faculty of Divinity, University of Cambridge, and he is also based at the Leverhulme Center for Life in the Universe. He has taught in numerous universities, Yale Divinity School, Princeton Theological Seminary, to name a few, and he has held appointments at the Center for Theological Inquiry, which is where you're kind of permanently based, right? Yeah. And Boston University School of Theology. And I know Fred as a ethicist and somebody who is working out on the implications of natural sciences for theology today. So we are really privileged to have you to speak with us today. And the title of your talk today is Origins of Life Research, a New Nexus for Natural Theology. So please join me to welcome Fred Simmons.
Thank you for that introduction. And indeed, thank you to everyone here at the Faraday for the invitation to be with you this afternoon. The research seminars have been an intellectual highlight of my time here in Cambridge. So for me, it's a real pleasure to be able to contribute to them this afternoon. It's also very gratifying to see colleagues and friends, even former students here today. So I look forward to the opportunity to have a conversation with all of you after my formal remarks. So as Pui mentioned, the title of my presentation is Origins of Life Research, a New Nexus for Natural Theology. Accounting for life's origin is among the contemporary natural sciences' most difficult challenges. It may also be among these sciences' most theologically significant contributions. Whatever else it may be, life is an extraordinarily complex chemical reaction. So complex that the simplest form of extant life is orders of magnitude more complex than the most complex non-living organic chemistry. Origins of Life research is the scientific study of how that gap in complexity between the most complex non-living organic chemistry and the simplest form of extant life could be, or perhaps even in fact was, overcome. A few prominent scientists have argued that this gap in complexity is so vast that life's emergence was simply a sheer random accident. After all, in a universe that has existed for some 13.4 billion years, and evidently has billions and billions of planets, asteroids, and comets, even utterly improbable things can happen once or twice. Nevertheless, the gap in complexity between non-living organic chemistry and the simplest organisms is so great, and the combinatoric possibility space of amino acids is so vast, that life's arising by chance even once in our universe, as old and large as it is impossibly unlikely. Thus, those who maintain that life arose sheerly by chance generally appeal to the multiverse, or the idea that there are very many, perhaps an infinity, of different universes. That the multiverse is needed to make life's arising sheerly by chance somewhat plausible has led some people to reject that explanation by invoking the principle of parsimony, also known as Occam's razor, namely that the simplest explanation is preferable. For example, an alternative explanation for life's origin that is much simpler than sheer chance, given chance's need to appeal to the multiverse to have much plausibility, attributes life's origin to God's special immediate action. According to this explanation, life did not arise sheerly by chance because God deliberately bridged the overwhelming gap in complexity between organic chemistry and life through special immediate divine action. And for all we know about the origin of life, perhaps God did create life through such special immediate divine action. Of course, this explanation does not contribute to origins of life research. except perhaps only negatively, by implying that such research is futile. Since natural scientific research cannot study special immediate divine action per se, only its effects. However, this explanation that God created life through special immediate divine action is sometimes presented as if it contributes to theology. Yet I think this way of relating origins of life research and theology is imprudent, and I'll offer 3 reasons for that this afternoon. Before offering these reasons, it will help to have a fuller statement of the kind of theological argument that I'm criticizing. This kind of argument claims that because more than 80 years of diligent research has yet to uncover a convincing naturalistic explanation for how the gap in complexity between the most intricate organic chemistry and the simplest organism could have been overcome by anything other than impossibly improbable chance, and because no convincing naturalistic explanation for overcoming that gap by anything other than such chance currently seems forthcoming, the fact that this gap in complexity has been overcome, which is demonstrated by life's existence, shows that there must be a supernaturalistic explanation, namely God's immediate special action. In short, this sort of argument maintains that the inability of origins of life research to account for life's origin is evidence for a supernatural explanation for life's origin, and hence evidence for God's existence and activity. Formally, this argument is analogous to the better known argument concerning key evolutionary transitions made by proponents of intelligent design, namely, that major leaps in complexity across evolutionary history cannot be accounted for naturalistically, and so offer evidence that God's special, immediate action is the cause of this complexity. This remains a disputed and polarizing argument within evolutionary biology. And given its polarization, I think this dispute often absolutizes and falsely opposes naturalistic and theistic explanations by contending that a naturalistic explanation would not point to God, or that God would not work with natural intermediaries, when in fact, the naturalistic explanation must be so biased towards complexity that it strongly suggests a theological foundation. However, since I'm addressing the origin of life this afternoon and not the origin of species, I will not discuss the intelligent design arguments further, other than to note that it too is an example of a God of the gaps version of natural theology. Returning to origins of life research, I think there are 3 theological reasons to resist the argument that the difficulty of accounting for how the gaps in complexity between organic chemistry and biology was overcome is evident that God overcame that gap supernaturally through special immediate action. First, God of the gaps arguments have not fared well historically. As the scope of natural scientific explanation increases through scientific advance, the gaps in naturalistic explanation correspondingly decrease. Accordingly, if the scope of divine action and the evidence for God's existence is associated with these gaps in naturalistic explanation, then as these gaps decrease, God's action and evidence for God's existence correspondingly decreases. Second, there are scriptural reasons to oppose a God of the gaps argument with respect to abiogenesis in particular. For example, Genesis 1 depicts God as summoning the earth and waters that God has made to bring forth life. For example, verse 11, quote, "Then God said, 'Let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed and fruit trees of every kind on earth, that bear fruit with the seed in it. And so it was. End quote. And again, verse 20, quote, and God said, let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the dome of the sky. End quote. That is, Scripture does not depict God as creating plants or animals, and these are synecdoches for all non-human terrestrial life, through special immediate divine action, but instead by summoning God's non-human creation to exercise its own potential to give rise to life. Third, God of the Gap's arguments assume an understanding of the God-world relationship, wherein divine and creaturely action operate in the same sense and therefore are mutually exclusive. That is why this argument envisions immediate special divine action as filling gaps in naturalistic arguments and depicts naturalistic explanations as ruling out divine activity. However, Genesis 1 presents God as creating life by having God's creation bring it forth. For example, consider again verse 20, this time followed by verse 21. Quote, and God said, let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth and across the dome of the sky. So God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves, of every kind, with which the waters swarm, and every winged bird of every kind. Close quote. Genesis evidently opposes the mutually exclusive understanding of naturalistic or creaturely on the one hand, and divine agency on the other, that God of the Gap's arguments assume. So, although accounting for life's origin by immediate special divine action is an alternative to the view that life arose by sheer chance, it not only offers no scope for natural scientific origins of life research, there are key theological reasons to oppose it. However, there is another alternative to the view that life arose by sheer chance that both offers scope for natural scientific origins of life research and, I will argue, offers support for theological conclusions. This is the view that attributes its life origin to nature's abiogenetic bias. Abiogenesis refers to the origin of life from non-living organic chemistry. In this context, bias refers to properties or a process that is more likely to give rise to some of its basic possibilities than others. For example, biased dice are more likely to turn up the side to which they are loaded than they are to turn up on any other single side. Taken together, then, abiogenetic bias denotes that physical or chemical properties or forces are more likely to produce life than some of their other possibilities. And if physics and or chemistry is abiogenetically biased, then life did not arise sheerly by chance. Origins of life research is fundamentally the scientific study of whether nature is abiogenetically biased. However, for that study to be rational, origins of life researchers must assume that nature is abiogenetically biased and seek to determine in what ways nature is abiogenetically biased. After all, natural science seeks to understand natural phenomena by identifying replicable results that delineate physical processes and forces that are ultimately explicable in terms of natural constants and laws. Accordingly, if life arose simply by chance, it would not be a replicable result, and hence not a fruitful subject for natural scientific research. Yet, although it is clear why it is necessary to assume that nature is abiogenetically biased, if origins of life is to be a fit subject for natural scientific research, why assume that the origin of life is a fit subject for natural scientific research? That is, why assume that nature is abiogenetically biased? Despite decades of sophisticated work, basic aspects of origin of life research remain indeterminate, and hence many fundamental facets of the field are contentious. For example, origins of life researchers disagree on whether life initially acquired the capacity to replicate or to metabolize. Likewise, origins of life researchers disagree on whether Earth life initially emerged beneath Earth's oceans, in small terrestrial pools, on Mars, or beyond Earth's solar system. Nevertheless, origins of life researchers generally agree about the answer to my question, namely, that the reason it makes sense to assume that nature is abiogenetically biased, and thus to undertake origins of life research, is that it is exceedingly unlikely that life's extraordinary complexity arose simply by chance. However, this is a juncture where philosophy may contribute to, or at least complicate, the natural sciences, since philosophical reflection shows that life's extraordinary complexity is not a sufficient reason to doubt that life arose simply by chance. After all, the extraordinary complexity of all sorts of things, for example, the current arrangement of molecules in this room, provides no reason to doubt that these things arose simply by chance. Instead, other grounds are necessary to have good reason to doubt that these things arose simply by chance. So why think that life's extraordinary complexity is any different? A common answer is that life is special. This specialness can be characterized in different ways. For example, that life is self-constructing, self-maintaining, and self-replicating, that it has low entropy, that it diversifies and complexifies, that it has well-being, that it strives to maintain its well-being, is destined to lose its well-being, and contributes to the well-being of other life through the loss of its own. And all these properties are indeed special. The current arrangement of molecules in this room has none of them. However, if there's no merely naturalistic reason to think that the constants and laws of physics and chemistry would be biased toward the emergence of any of these special features of life, and there seems to be no such naturalistic reason, then a merely naturalistic reason to doubt that life arose simply by chance remains to be found. And if that is the case, there's as yet no naturalistic reason, at least no merely naturalistic reason, to do origins of life research. Now, for the sake of communicating this rather complicated idea, I've bracketed any specific data or particular origins of life theories, and instead observed simply that there's no generic, merely naturalistic reason to think that nature is abiogenetically biased. Yet even if there are data or origins of life theories that offer merely naturalistic reasons to think that nature is abiogenetically biased, I've noted that origins of life research must assume that nature is abiogenetically biased in order to be a rational undertaking. Accordingly, although this assumption may be supported by this research, the decision to engage in this research cannot cogently depend on the results of this research. Instead, the assumption that nature is abiogenetically biased, which rational origins of life research requires, must rest on some other reason. And as I've indicated, this reason is the intuition that it is exceeding unlikely that life's extraordinary complexity arose simply by chance. That this is the reason that scientists conduct origins of life research is corroborated by the fact that when a given data set or a particular theory about the origin of life that seemed to support the assumption that nature is abiogenetically biased turns out not to do so, or to do so very tenuously, origins of life researchers do not typically look for other data sets or theories that seem to support this assumption before continuing their origins of life research. Instead, they look for such data and seek to devise such theories as aspects of their origins of life research, precisely because their assumption that nature is abiogenetically biased does not depend upon origins of life research. On the contrary, the cogency of that research depends upon this assumption. Although it's unclear whether there are good naturalistic reasons to assume that nature is abiogenetically biased, there are obvious supernatural reasons to think that nature is abiogenetically biased. Namely, that God values life's special features and so biased some of the natural constants and laws abiogenetically. But why think that God values life's special features? One possibility that I'll explore this afternoon is that while all physical or chemical things have being, only and all living things have well-being. Well-being is a type of value that denotes what is intrinsically good for a thing. Given that life, unlike merely physical or chemical entities, regulates and reproduces itself, life can be intrinsically helped or harmed. That is, things can be better or worse for life. Accordingly, life may not only be good or bad for a given purpose, life has a good. Moreover, this good matters to the entities that have it. Life values its own value. Life, therefore, has interests, namely to protect and promote its well-being by, among other things, responding to stimuli and otherwise endeavoring to maintain homeostasis in order to grow and reproduce. To feel the force of this difference between being and well-being, consider a world solely of lifeless objects or artifacts. This world may be beautiful or scientifically interesting, and so it may have aesthetic, noetic, or other kinds of value. Nevertheless, it is impossible to be beneficent to such a world, whatever its value, since in a world without well-being, nothing has a good to promote. By contrast, consider a world of well-understood, unremarkable microbes. It may not be beautiful or scientifically interesting, and so may have negligible aesthetic or noetic value. All the same, it is possible to be beneficent to such a world, namely by contributing to the survival, growth, and reproduction of its microbes, since microbes have a good, and promoting it enhances their well-being. Accordingly, if the creator of nature is benevolent, it has reason to bias nature abiogenetically, since it can only be beneficent to its creatures if these creatures are alive. Christians, of course, maintain that the creator of nature is benevolent by affirming that God is love. Conceiving of God as creating life by biasing nature abiogenetically is an alternative to conceiving of God as creating life through special, immediate divine action, and a useful way to conceptualize the relationship between God, the benevolent creator of nature, and the abiogenetically biased nature that God may create is to distinguish between primary and secondary causality. Unlike the God of the gaps theology that interprets divine and creaturely causality as operating in the same sense and thus as mutually exclusive, the distinction between primary and secondary causality interprets divine and creaturely causality as operating in different senses and thus as complementary. Moreover, according to the distinction between primary and secondary causality, the primary cause gives being and potency to the secondary cause. So the primary and secondary causality are not only complementary, but secondary causality depends upon primary causality. Natural science concerns secondary causality. It asks questions like what things are and how they operate, while metaphysics and theology concern primary causality. They ask questions like why things are as they are and why they operate as they do. Thus, in investigating whether nature is abiogenetically biased, and if so, how, origins of life research concerns secondary causality, while in examining why nature is abiogenetically biased, if it is, philosophy and theology concern primary causality. This distinction between primary and secondary causality can clarify the relationship between origins of life research and Christian theology. To appreciate this, recall my argument that the character of God and one of life's special features combine to offer a good reason to assume that nature is abiogenetically biased. Namely, that a God of love will be benevolent, and that because life is the only physical entity that has well-being, it is uniquely capable of being benefited. Since cogent origins of life research assumes that nature is abiogenetically biased, basic Christian theological commitments can warrant such research. Thus, whether Christian natural theology conduces to origins of life research depends on the understanding of the God-world relationship that it assumes. Specifically, while natural theology that invokes a God of the gaps obviates origins of life research, natural theology that appeals to primary and secondary causality supports it. In addition, the converse is also true, namely that origins of life research can support basic Christian theological commitments. What is more, such research can support these commitments in two ways. The first way comes from the practice of origins of life research itself. Since cogent origins of life research assumes that nature is abiogenetically biased, and there is as yet apparently no good naturalistic reason for this assumption, insofar as this research is cogent, its practice implicitly supports the supernatural reason for this assumption. This is admittedly a minimal form of support, since origins of life research may not be cogent. The assumption that currently makes it cogent may be erroneous, or its eventual cogency may rest on yet to be established naturalistic reasons. Still, it is worth noting that while the cogent practice of origins of life research undercuts God of the gaps natural theology by implying that nature is abiogenetically biased, and thus that life's origin is not due to God's special immediate action, cogent origin of life research supports, albeit only modestly, natural theology that posits God as a benevolent primary cause, since such research assumes that nature is abiogenetically biased. An affirmation of a benevolent primary cause bolsters this assumption. The second way origins of life research can support basic Christian theological commitments comes from this research's potential findings. In particular, since there is no merely naturalistic reason to expect nature to be abiogenetically biased, if origins of life research finds evidence that nature is abiogenetically biased, this research will support the supernatural reason to expect such bias, namely, that nature is the creation of a loving God. In short, if origins of life research is successful, it will serve as a new nexus for natural theology. That is, reasoning about God, or theology, that is based on nature. Just as natural theology may draw upon different understandings of the God-world relationship, natural theology may make different kinds of arguments. For example, the inference from the existence of something special that seems unlikely to have arisen simply by chance to the conclusion that this special something was purposefully brought into existence is often called the teleological argument. Since, as many of you know, teleology refers to ends, goals, and purposes. Accordingly, if origins of life research finds that nature is abiogenetically biased, it will establish the existence of something special that seems unlikely to have arisen simply by chance, and so furnish the basis for a version of the teleological argument that concludes that nature was purposefully brought into existence. Moreover, because I've argued that life's unique capacity to be benefited is one of the things that makes nature, that makes abiogenetic bias special, the version of the teleological argument that origins of life research may support would interpret discovery that nature is abiogenetically biased as evidence that nature was purposefully brought into existence by a benevolent force, or in Christian terms, that nature's abiogenetic bias is evidence that it is the creation of a God of love. It's important not to overstate the significance of the teleological argument. In particular, because the teleological argument is inductive, it is only probabilistic, not demonstrative, whatever origins of life research may find. Consequently, the teleological argument cannot prove its conclusions. After all, just as assumptions, like nature being abiogenetically biased, may be erroneous, it is always possible that something special that seems unlikely to have arisen simply by chance, like nature's abiogenetic bias, did in fact arise simply by chance. Unlikely things are not impossible. Still, identification of something that genuinely seems unlikely to have arisen by chance because it is complex and special is evidence, albeit not conclusive evidence, that it was purposefully brought into existence, or in more colloquial terms, that it had a designer. It's also important not to misapply the teleological argument by basing it on things that do not actually provide evidence of being designed. This observation is especially pertinent in Cambridge, since the teleological argument for the existence of God was made famous by the Cambridge theologian William Paley at the beginning of the 19th century, and was undermined 60 years later by the Cambridge biologist Charles Darwin. As many of you know, Paley claimed that organisms' exquisite integration of means to ends and elegant adaptation to their environment are special properties that seem as unlikely to have arisen simply by chance as the intricate machinery that allows a watch to keep time precisely. And as many of you also know, Darwin's theory of evolution ostensibly shows that organisms' exquisite integration of means to end and elegant adaptation to their environment, although complex and special properties, are not evidence of design, since these properties can apparently be accounted for by random mutation and natural selection. These are processes that have no designs and involve no designer. I think abiogenetic bias in nature would be more like a watch, and hence genuine evidence of design, than an organism that only seems to be designed, because absent a multiverse, there is no analog of random mutation and natural selection to determine the contents of the natural laws or the values of the natural constants. But this is difficult to determine decisively. It may depend on the sort of abiogenetic bias, if any, that is found. In any case, even if abiogenetic bias is more like a watch than an organism, and so is genuine evidence of design, I do not expect origins of life research to restore natural theology to the academic prominence that it enjoyed in the decades after William Paley, even if it were to discover that the natural constants and laws are abiogenetically biased. As I've indicated, such discovery would support theists who interpret God as the loving creator of nature, and thus it would not be theologically inconsequential. Still, discover that nature is abiogenetically biased would hardly be theologically revolutionary either, since theists who conceive of God as the loving creator of nature are already likely to anticipate nature to be abiogenetically biased, particularly if they regard Genesis 1 as scripture and embrace the distinction between primary and secondary causality. Conversely, because contemporary academic culture is so naturalistic, particularly beyond the humanities, and as I have noted, the teleological argument is only probabilistic, I doubt that origins of life research will revive natural theology's academic standing, even if it were to offer a new nexus for such theology by discovering nature to be abiogenetically biased. However, precisely because contemporary academic culture is so naturalistic, I expect that discovery that nature is abiogenetically biased would have significant impact on contemporary non-religious spirituality. For it would establish that life is not an absurd anomaly of value and sensitivity in an otherwise pointless, indifferent, and inimical universe, as many who are not religious interpret contemporary natural science to imply. The story of the anthropic principle illustrates both this prevailing interpretation of the contemporary natural sciences' spiritual implications and the impact that discovery of abiogenetic bias in nature would have on that interpretation. The story of the anthropic principle is complicated, since this principle has strong and weak forms, and different people distinguish between these forms of the principle differently. However, concentrating on the meaning ascribed to the anthropic principle by the person who introduced it, Brandon Carter, suffices to illustrate the potential spiritual significance of origins of life research. Carter introduced the anthropic principle in 1973 at a symposium in Poland celebrating the 500th anniversary of Copernicus's birth in order to complement what had come to be known as the Copernican principle. The Copernican principle is roughly the notion that human beings do not occupy a special place in the cosmos. This principle is scientifically crucial since it authorizes generalizations about chemistry, physics, and cosmology based on human beings' necessarily parochial and perspectival observations. However, this principle proved spiritually devastating, as its displacement of human beings from their presumptively central role in the universe contributed to a cultural sense of human marginalization within and ultimately alienation from the material world that stoked existentialism, atheism, and nihilism. This sense was amplified among those who interpreted subsequent discoveries in geology, in particular uniformitarianism's immense extension of geological time, and biology, in particular Darwinism's effacement of human physiological and phylogenetic distinctiveness, as cumulatively discrediting traditional philosophical and theological anthropologies and cosmologies that affirmed human beings' cosmic importance, life's consonance within material reality, and reality's fundamental goodness. Carter sought to temper these spiritual implications of astronomy, geology, and biology by noting that although human beings are not in the spatial center of the universe, the human perspective remains special, insofar as it could not have risen in virtually any other universe or on an astronomical timescale at virtually any other time in the universe. Accordingly, Carter called these special features of the human perspective the anthropic principle. And he claimed that recognition of this principle shifts human self-perception from marginal denizens of a vast and indifferent universe to imminent observers of a cosmos elegantly ordered to enable them to arise at just this point in its development. While the anthropic principle was devised as a complementary corrective to the spiritual implications of the Copernican principle, origins of life research investigates whether nature is abiogenetically biased. Nevertheless, were this research to discover such bias, I anticipate it to have similar spiritual implications, since discovery of abiogenetic bias would demonstrate that human beings are not a tragic cosmic anomaly, but rather self-aware members of a marvelously biophilic universe. Yet, although discovery of an abiogenetically biased universe may importantly alter human self-perception, confining the spiritual significance of origins of life research to its impact on human self-perception is objectionably parochial, since such bias favors life per se, not only human beings. Accordingly, on analogy with the Copernican and anthropic principles, the spiritual significance of discovering abiogenetic bias could be designated the biotic principle, namely, not just the affirmation that the cosmos can support life, which we already know, but the assurance that the cosmos favors life. These are considerable contributions. However, origins of life research may offer still more to natural theology and non-religious spirituality, depending on what it discovers. In particular, the character of nature's abiogenetic bias, if nature turns out to be abiogenetically biased, may not only support the traditional Abrahamic commitment to the existence of God as a loving creator of nature, and counter the widespread contemporary sense that life is a tragic accident in a pitiless, hostile world, but also enrich and refine theology and spirituality in religiously and ethically consequential ways. To explore these more determinate potential theological and ethical implications of origins of life research, it is necessary to specify how nature may be abiogenetically biased. And since origins of life research has yet to demonstrate that nature is abiogenetically biased, specifying how nature might be abiogenetically biased is necessarily speculative. Still, it is worth speculating momentarily and in conclusion on such potential abiogenetic bias to illustrate how origins of life research may inform and not only support theology. For the sake of this illustration, I will explore what I regard as a promising speculation about how nature may be abiogenetically biased that introduces the concept of dynamic kinetic stability. Dynamic kinetic stability may be unfamiliar, so I'll define the ideas that compose it. In this context, stability refers to the maintenance of a physical system in a relatively consistent state. Dynamic stability is a particular kind of stability, namely one in which a relatively consistent state is maintained, even though the components of that system are constantly changing. Waterfalls and rivers are an example of dynamic stability, since these physical systems maintain a relatively consistent state, even though the water molecules that compose these systems are constantly flowing through them. Finally, dynamic kinetic stability is a particular kind of dynamic stability, namely one in which the components of the system that is in a relatively consistent state are constantly undergoing chemical reactions. Organisms are examples of dynamic kinetic stability, since organisms maintain homeostasis even though the cells that compose them are constantly replicating and dying. And while they live, these cells themselves maintain homeostasis through constant chemical activity. Dynamic kinetic stability is therefore a property of replicating chemical systems in which the determinants of stability are the rate of replication and the rate of decay. Furthermore, because chemical replication requires free energy and resources, and free energy and resources are necessarily limited, dynamic kinetic systems that reach equilibrium between their rate of replication and rate of decay at higher populations are more stable than those that reach equilibrium at lower populations. Accordingly, both dynamic kinetic stability and thermodynamic stability are generally opposed, since high rate of replication requires significant free energy and resources. Indeed, organisms exhibit the highest degree of dynamic kinetic stability and are notoriously far from thermodynamic stability. Still, dynamic kinetic stability and thermodynamic systems are both driven from their respective forms of instability to their respective forms of stability. Specifically, since faster replication or slower decay outcompetes slower replication or faster decay for necessarily limited free energy and resources, less dynamically kinetically stable systems give way to more dynamically kinetically stable systems. Likewise, since higher free energy states give way to lower free energy states in thermodynamically driven chemical reactions, thermodynamically driven chemical reactions yield less ordered, more thermodynamically stable products, and so increase thermodynamic stability. Moreover, although dynamic kinetic stability and thermodynamic stability are generally opposed, dynamic kinetic systems are, of course, consistent with the laws of thermodynamics, which constrain all physical systems. In fact, increasing dynamic kinetic stability, and so increasing complexity and decreasing entropy within the dynamically kinetic system, is the fastest way to increase entropy overall. And life, by dint of its extraordinary complexity, is by far the most dynamically kinetically stable system in the known universe. Thus, although life itself has very low entropy and has decreased its own entropy through time, the universe's inexorable drive to increase entropy through time may not be contrary to life, as has frequently been assumed. Instead, the universe's inexorable drive to increase complexity through time may be one way that nature is abiogenetically biased, and indeed biased to increase biological complexity. If so, the second law of thermodynamics, which states that the entropy of a closed system always increases with time, may be interpreted as ordered not to its terminus of greater entropy, but to its most efficient means to that terminus, namely life, and indeed ever more complex life. From this perspective, thermodynamics does not just permit life, but promotes it. And the second law of thermodynamics is not nihilistic, but prolific. So now to my final slide. The sort of abiogenetic bias that would be consonant with basic theological convictions supports the shift in cultural perception of life's place in reality that I've described. Yet interpreting life in terms of dynamic kinetic stability also poses difficult theological questions, and I conclude by identifying and addressing one of them. Theological specificity is necessary to sharpen such questions, so given the context and to dramatize the effect, I'll consider Protestant Christianity, which, following the Apostle Paul, generally attributes all death to sin. Interpreting life in terms of dynamic kinetic stability poses a difficult theological question for such Protestant Christians, because although this interpretation indicates a way that nature may be abiogenetically biased, it also implies that death is part of life. After all, interpreting life in terms of dynamic kinetic stability renders life more a process than a thing. And since this process is dynamic and kinetic, the organisms that compose this process are necessarily replicating and dying. Indeed, given finite resources, dynamically kinetic processes are only sustainable if they are self-consumptive, and thus organisms survive and reproduce by feeding upon one another, whether causing or hastening others' deaths or decomposing those that have died. Yet, however manifold its proximate causes, death proves intrinsic to life when life is interpreted as a prodigious manifestation of dynamic kinetic stability. Protestant Christians who interpret all death to sin may respond to this potential form of abiogenetic bias in several ways. First, they could attribute dynamic kinetic stability and even thermodynamics to sin's distortion of God's creation. This would vindicate Paul's claim that death is the wages of sin. However, it would also mean that the goodness of God's creation is effectively gone, since sin would have transformed the most basic laws of physics. Moreover, it would contravene much of Scripture, particularly the wisdom literature, and therefore much of the rest of the Christian tradition, for example, St. Augustine and St. Thomas, since these sources attribute non-human death to God's creation per se, rather than its distortion by sin. Second, Protestant Christians who attribute all death to sin may distinguish between physical death, which is intrinsic to life when interpreted in terms of dynamic kinetic stability, and spiritual death, and insist that they and Paul attribute only spiritual death to sin. This would allow dynamic kinetic stability and thermodynamics to reflect God's creation per se, rather than its distortion by sin, even as spiritual death remains the wages of sin. However, it would contravene Paul's argument in his first letter to the Corinthians that Christian faith is futile and we are still in our sins if God did not resurrect Jesus from his physical death. It would also contravene Paul's claim in his letter to the Romans that human beings' physical death is due to sin, and that non-human life's futility and decay are subjections and enslavements rather than manifestations of God's supralapsarian creation. So third, Protestant Christians who interpret dynamic kinetic stability as a way that God's creation is abiogenetically biased may revise their view that all death is due to sin. This revision would be theologically consequential, since it would affect common Christian interpretations of the goodness of God's creation and the meaning of salvation from sin. This revision would also pose challenging questions about theodicy and the authority of Scripture. None of these alternatives are entirely comfortable for Christians who attribute all death to sin. However, when natural scientific findings do not simply support, but also challenge theology, they may be especially theologically useful. For in these instances, those findings can enrich and perhaps even refine theology. On such occasions, natural theology may not only strengthen Christian faith, it may teach this faith something as well. Accordingly, if origins of life research proves one of these instances by finding nature to be abiogenetically biased, it may not only constitute a major natural scientific breakthrough and a new nexus for natural theology, but also stimulate significant theological learning. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred, for this wonderfully stimulating talk. I've learned so much from this. And we have about 5 or so minutes for questions. Please, if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hands.
Yes, I wonder, on the basis of abiogenetic bias, how abundant you would expect life to be in the universe at large, whether you would expect it to be ubiquitous, and going further, what about intelligent life? Would that be ubiquitous, or would it be unique, or for some reason would it be somewhere in between? And that would be mysterious.
Yes, thank you for the question. I don't think abiogenetic bias determines the likelihood of intelligence. So abiogenetic bias would underdetermine that latter question. I think that it would. Much would turn on what kind of abiogenetic bias is found. But I think speaking in broad terms, yes, finding that nature is abiogenetically biased would increase the likelihood that there is exobiology, which is to say life beyond planet Earth.
I was very struck by this distinction between being and well-being.
Thanks. A little bit different here. A kind of linguistic comment to get your reaction, really. I just wonder if it's that helpful to use the word naturalistic when we're scientists and we're looking for scientific explanations for things. Because I noticed actually in one stage you use the word naturalistic in a purely philosophical sense, and another stage as in a sort of meaning a scientific explanation. I just wonder if the discussion would be clarified by avoiding the word naturalistic when we're talking about scientific explanations for things. That's just a comment to raise a question for a comment.
Yes, so two massive questions in a short,
like a few seconds.
yes, in a short bit of time. So how you might try to map well-being into the categories of truth, beauty, and goodness. I would assimilate it to goodness. I don't think goodness is exclusively a matter of well-being. Rather, I'd see well-being as a species of goodness. To your question about naturalism, you're exactly right. I think I was using one term to cover two different things. One is a methodological naturalism, and another is an ontological naturalism. And I just use naturalism without distinguishing between the two. But I think you're right that greater precision would be had if I were more rigorous in that distinction.
Thank you. I hope you agree with me that the number of bursting questions coming out of a seminar is evidence of an engaging seminar. So please, may you join me in thanking Fred again for this stimulating.